Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity to join this panel at this Congress on Public Health, and I think that question's put us on notice already that it's the very, very, very big questions that are at issue in this panel. So you might think that you're discussing global finance, public health and inequality, but I can tell you what we're really talking about here, and it's tax. It's really all about tax, and it's not an excuse to head to the door, even though it is 4:30 in the afternoon on day 4 of your conference. So this is a quote from a novel by one of Australia's great authors, Peter Carey, one of his early novels, The Tax Inspector, which is about a pregnant female auditor engaging with a corrupt and crazy business in Sydney's western suburbs in a tax audit. And this quote is, it was Alistair who was her boss, who she was having an affair with. It's a good book, you should read it. Anyway, Alistair who said on national television that being a tax officer was the most pleasant work imaginable, like turning on the tap to bring water to parched country. It felt wonderful to bring money flowing out of multinational reservoirs into childcare centres and hospitals and social services. He sold taxation as a public good. So the only thing about that I would question is the multinational reservoirs. There are not rivers of gold out there, but anyway, we might come back to that in the questions. Really, I'm focusing, as Ron had alluded to, on the national context, but in the context of this global economy and engaging with other countries across the world. So the subject of public finance concerns how can we raise finance to provide public goods? It's obviously that key challenge. But of course, it's also about politics, and specifically it's about the role of taxation to fund government. Revenue raising is about a particular form of decision-making and allocation of resources, and the form that has been most successful in terms of raising and sharing revenue is using some form of government, mostly, but not always, some form of political compromise in democratic government. It is also about global politics, but I guess my position or my starting point is that it's mostly about national politics. So, no taxation without representation. Those of you who are Australians may recognise that picture of the Eureka Stockade Rebellion from 1854, which was the letter of the rebels in this mining rebellion, which was a rebellion against tax. Did state in their letter that was sent to the police that taxation without representation is tyranny. And in fact, the Australian colonies were hotbeds of radicalism, as Australians will know as well. What you may not know is that a key reason for federation in Australia was to ensure equal treatment of people across the country who were in wildly disparate circumstances economically. And in particular to embed a minimum wage and to embed the age pension. It took a couple of decades after Federation for those things to really start to take effect, but that was one reason people consented to Federation. Even at Federation, it took, again, more decades to establish what we might think of as Australia's social state. So this is Australia's federal history in taxes. This chart takes us from 1901 to 2013. It's basically the tax as a proportion of GDP. I don't know how well you can read it, but at the bottom end, we had tax as a proportion of GDP. The tax level was about 5%. The colonies also had some debt when they joined the Federation, so the size of the state was a little larger. What you can see over the century is how we grew that tax base very substantially, partly to do with wars, of course, World War I, World War II, but also to do with building effective systems and the decision of the nation to fund the social state. So we can quite clearly see the link between the raising of tax revenues and the provision of hospital care, the provision of Medicare, the provision of social welfare and the pension. So what do we spend it on today? Well, this is from the federal budget from last year. This is what the federal government spends its money on. 3/4 of what governments spend their money on in Australia is social security and welfare cash transfers, health and education. In fact, more than 3/4. The other purposes triangle is money that goes to the states, and the states spend that money on education and health. It's the same in all rich countries. That's what we spend our money on these days. In fact, the most equal states in the world, the Nordic states, not surprisingly, have done the best at this provision of public goods, social transfers, and are most effective at taxation as well. So how do those most equal and rich states tax? They have high consumption taxes, very high. Value-added tax, 20% rate covering a substantial proportion of the consumption base. They have high income taxes and high social security taxes, not extreme rates, but pretty substantial taxes on most workers in those countries. They actually, you may be surprised to know, have relatively lower tax rates on capital income, capital gains, and corporations than they do on workers. They have very effective tax administration, high transparency, high commitment. What do they spend their money on? Universal public goods related to health and welfare systems that are somewhat targeted. The big challenge for poor countries, of course, is they struggle both to tax and to spend in ways that are redistributive and can support that well-being. This is a stat that comes out of the IMF. It's a fairly recent chart. The blue line at the top is the average OECD tax level. It's around about 33%. Now that's an average. It's fairly diverse within the OECD, and I'll go into that a little bit. The green line is those same OECD countries excluding their social security taxes, which are taxes on workers, taxes on wages. So what you can see is OECD countries on average raise around about 1/3 of the size of their economy in taxes into the public domain. But, you know, 1/3 of that is taxes directly on most workers in the economy. One of the key issues there is going to be that you need to be able to find those workers and track those wages. And we've already had this possibility, this alluded to, of the future of work, the challenge of the future of work, the casualised economy, underemployment, the informal economy. That's actually a big challenge to the structures we see even in rich countries. Poor countries are the red bars. This is over time, over the last decade. Poor countries are really struggling to raise taxes. They sit at an average of 11 or 12% of GDP. If you jump back to my Australian chart, that's the size of the Australian state in the 1920s. So it's both tax and spending that does it in terms of delivering equality. The left-hand chart here is taxes. The right-hand chart is social spending. Again, this is from a recent IMF report. The highest bar is the advanced economies. Obviously, they collect the most tax, and what you'll see is they spend most of it on public goods, as I had suggested. One of the things that you might find is a bit, I know I'm throwing lots of charts at you. I don't know how well you can read them. The blue bar is indirect taxation, value-added tax, excises and trade taxes. The stripes to the left are income tax. So one of the big things to note is how important income tax and social security taxes on wages are in rich countries, raising enough money to redistribute. How can we see the effect of these and understand the effect on inequality? Well, we can use that Gini coefficient and other similar measures. This is an OECD, again, I'm sorry, the focus is mostly on rich countries in these stats. The Gini of disposable income, right? That's after taxes and after cash welfare. How do we look at household disposable income? The lower Gini is the most equal state, right? The Gini ratio is about measuring inequality. Closer to zero, the more equal the society is. The higher ones are the most unequal. And I'm really sorry, probably you can't read, But let me tell you that at the left-hand end, it shouldn't surprise you, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, actually Slovenia, and then Finland are the most equal by far. At the right-hand end, you've got Chile, Mexico, and the United States. So there's no doubt that those countries are more unequal than the Nordic states. So what are some of the principles that we need to be considering? Well, the thing about the Nordic states, and there's lots of reasons why they're both an example to us and also not something that other countries can imitate, even if they wanted to. The Nordic states are both the most equal after taxes and welfare and public goods, and also the richest, right? So all the Nordic states are in the richest cohort of countries in the world, and so this is this issue. You can imagine a very equal country where everybody is equally poor, and we know that that happens. So it's not just about equality, it is about the size of the pie, which is what economists focus on when they talk about the role of taxes and spending in delivering economic growth. What are our fairness principles? Sorry, I've got a couple of other charts here, but I think I won't go into those. We can always come back if people have questions about taxes and social spending. I might not do that now. What are some of the principles we need to think about if we're thinking about trying to address these SDGs on inequality or thinking more generally about designing taxes? Well, it seems to me we actually need to recoup what we call the benefit principle, which fell out of favour in the 20th century. And that is the principle that most people must contribute most of the time to provide public goods in the state. And you have to acknowledge that it is the state that delivers those public goods, and so intensely political. Of course, we also need to think about ability to pay. Of course, the rich should pay more than the poor, but what we have to remember is that there is a cohesion role here for both taxes and public spending across the whole community. It does matter what happens at the top end, though. So you saw a little bit of that in Ron's presentation, the top 85 or the top 8. Look, to be honest, the top 8, that's not a tax problem. That's a political problem, right? Tax can no longer solve that, and it's quite possible that tax, even effective tax systems, could not have prevented that. There is something about the global economy in the last 20 years that has generated that concentration of wealth. However, taxes can do something, in particular for income. So it does matter. The top personal tax rates do matter for income inequality at the top end and for the accumulation of wealth. Just very briefly, at the left here, you've got as the top income share of the 1% goes up, as tax rates come down on the horizontal axis. The two countries that have become most unequal at the top end are the UK and the US. They really are outliers, actually, but every country that has dropped its top marginal rates has increased its inequality. So I'm conscious of time and I want to leave some time for questions, so I just want to say something about the global politics of tax as well. There's no doubt cross-country inequality is still high. Of course, poor countries are still poor and are kind of vulnerable or fragile economically. But poverty overall is falling, so we do need to think about that. It does seem to me that the key issue is not so much cooperation to build some sort of global tax base or somehow harness that global economy. It's still the nation state, it seems to me, that is the core of redistribution and delivery of public goods. And so what we need to be doing is thinking about cooperation between countries to enable those countries to raise their own taxes in order to deliver that equality. Some of the ways we can do that are the ways that we've seen in the media and so on. And you might have noticed the latest thing is Credit Suisse. There's 55,000 account details have been leaked. There's been a massive cross-country cooperation among some rich countries, including Australia, 1,000 account holders in Australia. So information exchange, collaboration and so on to collect taxes is the key. The big challenge is how to make sure that poor countries actually benefit from that international cooperation. And finally, I did want to say something about an international tax. Look, I'm interested and I'm supportive of the idea of an international tax, but pragmatically, I guess I'm a skeptic. There is a question as well about the design of such a tax. Many of these global tax proposals are intended to change economic behaviour. Tobin tax to quash speculation, for example, in financial markets, currency markets, or the carbon emissions tax, of course, to reduce our carbon emissions. So there's a big question as to how much revenue those taxes can raise. And of course, there's a question of, can we cooperate to deliver them? Where would the funds go? Are they to deliver international public goods? So I'm not saying we should not think about those matters, but I would say they are an addition to the national cooperation rather than a substitute for those. So I'll leave it there, and maybe we can come back to some issues and questions. Thank you.
Well, we'll just have a couple of minutes now for those who wish to come up, just more on specific, elucidation or clarification of issues that Miranda has raised, rather than, a general discussion on some of these issues, which are really important and complicated ones, which we'll come back to at our last half hour. But anyway, yes, just go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, Peter Sainsbury. Simple question of clarification. I've never heard an income tax referred to as a social welfare tax before. If I understood you correctly, can you explain to me why someone who obviously is on top of the issues as opposed to a fool would call it a social welfare tax rather than an income tax?
I think I was referring to both income taxes and social security taxes. And the revenue from those taxes they are the most important taxes in rich countries in delivering social welfare. So perhaps I ended up being a bit confusing. So a social security tax, those of you who are from Europe or from anywhere in Latin America or whatever will be very familiar with this. Most other countries, Australia and New Zealand are actually exceptions, have separate taxes on wages. And they're very substantial. They're withheld by the employer. In that sense, they're similar to personal income tax, but they usually apply from the first dollar on wages. The US has one as well, and they add on to the income tax as a very important source of revenue for those countries.
Just have one. Oh, so you got there first, so you go, and then you, yes.
I think it's a very quick and simple question. Alex Barrett from Sydney. If I understood you right, and maybe I didn't, I think you said that the most wealthy countries are able to be the most equitable, like Iceland and Norway, because they presumably they set up their taxation and their welfare systems in a way which use that national wealth to be equitable. But I just wonder about the causality. Do they set up equitable systems because they're wealthy? That's kind of what I understood you to be saying. Or are they wealthy because they set it up that way? Does that make sense?
Sounds a good question.
So the question makes sense, but again, perhaps I was a bit confusing. I wasn't saying that they're most wealthy, therefore they set up systems to be equitable. In fact, the US is more wealthy, right? What I was saying was, of all the countries that are most equal, right, they have the lowest Gini's, they have most succeeded in delivering equality through their tax and welfare systems. The Nordic states are the richest of those countries. So it's interesting to look at the tax structures of the Nordic states and the spending structures that they have, because they are both rich and equal. The US is rich and unequal. Australia is pretty rich and not as equal as the Nordic states. So,
thank you. That's a good point to clarify. And perhaps just one more question.
Yeah, mine's quick. Look, Thomas Piketty, when he was in Australia a few months back, singled out the need to have an inheritance tax because of the problem of capital, inherited wealth largely being through capital accumulation, not through wages and salaries. So you haven't mentioned in that at all the concept of death duties. Can you say something about that and which countries have them and why we don't?
So I agree, we should have inheritance taxes. Australia used to have them. We abolished them in 1981, which was a mistake. We do tax some wealth. We have some land tax. We have some property taxes and so on, but we tax wealth relatively lower than many other countries do. So we should have them. He's right. Having said that, wealth taxes are only ever going to deliver a small fraction of the revenue that you need to provide the kind of public goods and social welfare that we see. And that's the case across the world. Even countries that have substantial wealth taxes, the wealth tax delivers only a fraction of the revenue needed to deliver social services.